Brandon had been working as a taxi driver for 3 months. In that time, he saw a lot of crazy things. His car wasn't ideal. It broke down frequently and didn't look great. When Brandon joined the company, the new hire was deliberately given the oldest car available at that moment. Brandon's manager immediately realized that he was a modest man and decided to take advantage of him. So despite the presence of a qualified mechanic at the company, Brandon was forced to repair the taxi himself. Of course, this work was not in his job description, but there was nobody at the company who could stand up for him. Brandon personally looked over every part of the car given to him and changed all the old parts that needed replacement. The engine of his old Ford began to run like clockwork, which could not have gone unnoticed by his manager. Harry Hughes was an obese man of about 45 with a disgusting temper and a lot of bad habits. For some inexplicable reason, he disliked Brandon the moment he met him. At the same time, the young taxi driver was never late and never missed a shift. Unfortunately, Brandon's diligence brought him nothing but criticism from his superiors. He was always penalized for minor and oftentimes made-up offenses. And now, even though he was in such a rush to pick up a passenger, Brandon was driving as cautiously as possible. Brandon knew that Mr. Hughes equipped his car with a special monitor to keep track of his movements. What does he have against me? I'm not any worse than the other drivers. In many ways, I'm probably even better, but I still have to pay for my own repairs, even though mechanics carefully check the cars of the other drivers, Brandon thought as he drove carefully. Brandon was about half a mile away from his destination when a young woman ran out into the road. She held out her hands and motioned for him to stop. She was dressed in tattered jeans, old sneakers, and a matching hoodie. "Hey, what are you doing? Trying to kill yourself? You can't be jumping onto the road like that," shouted the taxi driver as he opened the door of his old Ford. The young woman froze in place and then looked at Brandon with eyes full of tears. "What's wrong, miss? Get in the car. I'll take you wherever you need to go," said Brandon in a trembling voice. Brandon did not have to repeat the offer, and the young woman got into the passenger seat immediately. Only then did the taxi driver notice that the young woman was pregnant. She wasn't too far into the pregnancy, but you could already see a baby bump. Brandon hesitated a little bit before asking, "Where to, miss?" The young woman wiped away a tear and sighed sadly. "I would like to go to the bank if possible." At that moment, Brandon felt extremely sad for the stranger who looked like she needed help. Gathering her thoughts, the young woman quietly added, "Unfortunately, I don't have any money. I was in prison because I was set up, but that's another story." Brandon shuddered in surprise and took another look at his passenger. "I hope you're not going to the bank to rob it," he said in an effort to defuse the situation with a joke. "Of course not. I'm not a criminal. It just so happened that I was deceived twice and left with nothing," the young woman explained with palpable sadness in her voice. The stranger's confession shocked Brandon so much that he completely forgot that he was actually on his way to pick up a different passenger. He knew that in a couple of minutes, the dispatcher would transfer the order to another driver, and nothing bad would happen. Therefore, Brandon drove the car towards the address given to him by the pregnant woman with a clear conscience. On the way, a lively conversation ensued between the taxi driver and the passenger. Brandon learned that the young woman's name was Julia Parker. She hardly talked about her life before prison, but did speak about her time in prison. In particular, she spoke about an affair she had with one of the guards who deceived her and abandoned her in the early stages of pregnancy. Unfortunately, the parole board reviewed Julia's case and decided to change the subject. After her release, Julia found herself without money and without the help of her loved ones. She was left to her own devices. Brandon did not know why the young woman needed to go to the bank, but felt that she really needed his help. Therefore, despite the indignant calls from the dispatcher over the walkie-talkie, the young taxi driver took Julia to the bank. Realizing that the young woman probably didn't have much money to spend on the ride, Brandon did not take any money from her. "Thank you so much. I will make sure to find you and pay you back," said Julia as she was leaving the taxi. Brandon followed her with his eyes and mentally wished her good luck. At that moment, Brandon's soul was filled with warmth. the likes of which he had never experienced before. He knew that an unpleasant conversation with his boss couldn't be avoided, but at that moment it seemed petty and unimportant. The strange passenger's story stirred up the most tender feelings in his soul. Brandon did not know why exactly Julia received such a harsh sentence, but he suspected that she didn't deserve it. When he brought the car back to the parking lot at the end of the day, the young taxi driver came face to face with the boss, who was awaiting his return. "Why didn't you accept the ride assigned to you by the dispatcher? Do you use the company car for your own pleasure?" Henry Hughes asked without hiding his irritation. "No, sir. How can you even think of such a thing? I didn't use the car for personal purposes. I simply took a young woman who was in trouble to the bank. I will reimburse you for all expenses associated with the wasted fuel and personally pay for the ride of the passenger that I didn't pick up." Brandon tried to rectify the situation. Howard Hughes knew where the young man took the car, but didn't care. The boss wanted to humiliate the young man and to put him in his place. "Why would I need your lousy money? Who will pay me for the time you spent on that woman? What do you want, to feel like a superhero? I know what you small-towners are like," exclaimed the boss. Brandon turned pale. For him, that was a truly low blow. He could forgive anything, but not like this. Brandon was already embarrassed by the fact that he moved to New York from a remote northern Kentucky town in search of a better life. Brandon knew that his boss would always see him as a provincial boy who came to steal other people's jobs and maybe even his position. In an effort to defend himself, Brandon said a few harsh words to the boss, which infuriated him. "Out. I never want to see you here again. You can forget about getting paid. That will be my compensation for your use of the company car for your personal purposes," exclaimed Harry Hughes as he pointed to the door. Brandon expected to hear anything but that. How could someone fire a taxi driver after he paid for a client out of his own pocket and even reimbursed the company for the used gas? In Brandon's eyes, that was the height of unfairness. Realizing that nothing can change his boss's mind, Brandon handed in the car keys and trudged towards the exit. Despite losing his job, deep down, Brandon was relieved that he no longer had to put up with this idiot boss's insults. He could finally breathe freely. Of course, without a salary or job, Brandon understood that hard times awaited him. Most likely, we would have to give up renting an apartment and instead move into a cheap hostel. In fact, Brandon didn't even have enough money for food. Knowing that, Harry Hughes' actions seemed especially vile. On the day he was fired, Brandon barely left his rented apartment. He was really hurt by the fact that he was thrown out onto the street like some animal. Brandon worked hard for the benefits of the company and suddenly found himself without a job for a bogus reason. As he plunged deeper and deeper into depression, Brandon could not pull himself together to start looking for a new job. The following day, he heard a knock on his door. Wondering who it could be, Brandon opened the door. To his surprise, he saw the young woman who cost him his job. Brandon's shock knew no bounds, and for good reason. The thing is that Julia looked a lot more well-off than the first time they met. The former prisoner was now wearing a chic coat, a white scarf, and classy boots. Rings glittered on her thin fingers, and a diamond bracelet was visible on her wrist. "Wow, did you really rob that bank?" Brandon joked. "Of course not. I just took what was legally mine," Julia answered with a smile. The young people looked at each other and laughed in unison without saying a word. Frankly speaking, Brandon was very happy to see the young woman and didn't want her to leave. Moreover, Julia wanted to discuss something very important with him. He offered her a seat and a cup of hot tea and prepared to listen to her story. It turned out that in the recent past, Julia Parker was a wealthy heiress whose father left her an impressive inheritance. Unfortunately, her mother-in-law and half-brother claimed that they were the rightful heirs to her father's fortune. They decided to get rid of Julia with the help of a fabricated criminal case. They hoped to put her away for many years. The conspirators thought out their plan to the smallest detail. Julia, who was trusting by nature, noticed the danger too late. Her stepmother and half-brother did a great job. Fabricated evidence, false witnesses, and a bogus accusation. resulted in Julia ending up in court in record time. The court's verdict plunged Julia into a state of deep shock. 4 years in the state county jail was too harsh a punishment for a woman falsely accused. Julia went through a lot before she was released. As it turned out, the vile conspirators did not take into account one thing. Before his death, Julia's late father transferred money into a bank account that he opened in her name. Only Julia and no one else could access the account and the businessman's huge fortune. Only then did Brandon understand why she was so eager to get to the bank. Julia steadfastly endured all the hardships that fell upon her, including having a relationship with a scoundrel and getting pregnant before she finally went free. During this time, Julia's stepmother and half-brother squandered everything that they had and were broke by the time Julia was released. Of course, they knew that they couldn't expect Julia to help them. They fled as soon as they learned about her release from prison. After listening to Julia's story, Brandon was shocked to say the least. "What do you plan to do next?" Brandon asked cautiously. "I want to start by buying the taxi company in which you worked." "Yes, don't be surprised. I already knew you were fired, and I intend to restore justice," Julia replied with a smile. At that moment, Brandon thought that he had misheard her. Buying a whole company just like that? The young man from a modest background had never heard of such a thing. "What about my former boss, Harry Hughes?" Brandon wondered out loud. "You won't have to worry about him. The scoundrel will be fired immediately, and you will replace him. I already reached out to the company's CEO and put down an initial payment," Julia said in an assertive tone. Brandon had never before seen so much determination and inner strength in someone's eyes. Not wanting to put things on the back burner, Julia suggested that he start his new position immediately. Needless to say, Harry Hughes was extremely surprised when he was asked to leave the position and vacate his office immediately. "I'm sorry, Harry, it's nothing personal. You know, times are changing," Brandon said to Harry Hughes as he watched him leave. Harry Hughes understood what was happening without needing an explanation. He lowered his eyes, gathered his things, and went towards the exit. Just the day before, he felt like a powerful man and was now feeling like he reached rock bottom. After taking on the managerial position, Brandon directed all of his efforts to developing the company and improving its services. Under his leadership, the company's profits almost doubled, and his employees began to receive decent wages. If the rumors are true, Brandon began dating the owner of the company and intends to marry her. An ultrasound revealed that Julia is carrying twins, so he is preparing to be a two-time daddy. Brandon doesn't separate into mine and yours, which means that his beloved Julia's children will also be his children.